This week on Dig Me Out,
I'll never forget that song. I will never. You should hop onto Spotify and see if you
No, I don't want to hear that.
You want to hear it? Yeah, you do. Oh, yeah, you do.
Tim and Jay review Front End Loader by Front End Loader.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Dig Me Out. I'm your host, Tim Minichi, and joining me for episode 175 of season 4, my co-host, your friend and ours, our friend and yours, something like that, Mr. Jason Ziak. Jay, I try to come up with new and interesting, witty ways to introduce you, but sometimes I trick myself and make it too complicated.
I heard that.
Yeah.
You sort of tripped and stumbled there.
What I need is for you to jump in and be like, I should say, I'm your host, Tim Minichi, and then you go, and I'm Jason Ziak.
Okay.
I'll throw it to you, you throw it to
and
me.
And together we say, welcome to another episode
of, and then like a cheerleading squad goes, dig me out.
Wow.
That's my plan. That's my grand plan for how this, that's how this all going to go down.
That sounds super annoying.
It does. And I'm looking to alienate as many listeners as possible. So one of the ways we do that, that's not true. One of the ways we actually try to ingratiate ourselves to the listeners is by allowing them to pick the records we're going to review. We call those requested reviews.
Requested review.
And we have one this week. It's from Mr. Gavin Reed, frequent requester of albums and bands, previous host of the, or co-host, or guest, I should say, of the show. And he provided us with another pick from Down Under, from Australia, the band Front End Loader. Now, Jay, are you familiar, or were you familiar with the band Front End Loader?
No, I'm not.
Neither was I. Now, they had an album that Gavin had provided us with during, I think it was like season 1. Sent us like a little USB stick full of a whole bunch of Australian bands he wanted us to check out, and they were on there. And there was an album by this band called Last of the V8 Interceptors. And I remember the name just because it reminded me of the movie Mad Max 2, which I believe is the vehicle that Mad Max drives. It's a V8 Interceptor.
You talking about the Road Warrior?
Yeah, Mad Max 2, the Road Warrior.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that piqued my interest. You know, anytime a band mentions automobiles, I find that interesting. But I prefer to actually not listen to the bands that are not suggested until we actually get around to reviewing them. So I purposely did not listen to Front End Loader so that we could get to them one day when Gavin suggested them, and then lo and behold, this year, Gavin suggested it. So we're going to review their debut album, which is self-titled. And before we do so, let's talk a little history of the band.
History of the band.
They formed in December 91 in the Sydney, Australian suburb of Darlington. The members of the band are and were Bowden Campbell on guitars and vocals, Davis Claymore on lead vocals and guitar, Richard Corey on bass guitar, and Peter Kostick on drums. And so 1991 they formed. They are still together, and it's still the original 4 members. No lineup change. That's fairly remarkable. They've only released 5 studio albums in that time. Their first album was released in June of 1993. That's the self-titled Front End Loader, which we're reviewing. Their second album, Let's Ride, came out in March of 1995. The aforementioned Last of the V8 Interceptors came out in August 1997. They put out their 4th album, How Can We Fail When We're So Sincere, in March of 2002, and then there was a break of 9 years. May of 2011, they released the album Rit Tardando, which I believe is a musical term. Not exactly sure what it means, but I believe so. And they've released a number of EPs, including one in 2012. Throughout the years, I think there's like 8 or 9 EPs that they've released. If you go to their website, it's actually fairly humorous. It's frontendloaderband.com. And the tagline for the website is Australia's least popular, relatively well-known band.
That about sums it up, huh?
Yeah. And they actually mention in the biography for the release of the 2011 album Retardando that you should please space out the listening of the songs to 2 to 3 a year because they're not planning on making another record for at least 7 years. So, there you go. That's the history of Front End Loader. I believe they have won, I believe it was their last record actually won them an ARIA, which is the Australian equivalent of a Grammy for Best Hard Rock Album. So, a band that was, 20 years into their career finally won an award. So, that's pretty interesting. And they did not show up for that award because they said they were not wealthy enough. They didn't have enough money to actually show up and accept the award. So we got some Facebook feedback on this record. Scott Russell Hallgrim, I hear Seaweed, DRI, and Descendants/All. Never heard of these guys before, but I love this so much. And then Gavin Reed, the man who suggested this album for us, said, I'm a little bit apprehensive about how this sounds to new ears, but in '93 this was a fantastic conduit from metal to punk without really being either. If anything, it may be a little more punk version of early Faith No More, or even a metal pre-Blood Sugar Chili Peppers. Regardless, the All-Star Jam is still one of my favorite songs, and the concept of Jesus auditioning people for a band and saying, "You are fucking great," could only be done in 1993 and in Australia. I should add that they're still the most consistently amazing live band I've seen. I saw them a lot. Also, strangely, for that sound, they are actually really crisp live. Often music that raucous becomes sludge live. That's a good point there, Gavin. So, Jay, first I want to mention if you have an album that you would like us to review, please visit our request to review page at digmeoutpodcast.com. So, Jay, let's talk about what we liked and what we did not like about this record. I'm going to throw it to you first, Jay. Give me something that you really liked about Front End Loader.
The vocals. I really like the sound of his voice. And there's even some parts where they do harmonies. And for the style of voice that he has, which is pretty raspy, they do some gang vocal stuff. It's fairly aggressive, but he can also kind of tone it down and get into like a Mark Lanigan space at times. But I love the sound of the voice, and then I love that they take that style of voice and actually do harmonies with it, which is not something you hear a lot with that style of voice. You think of harmonies being a little bit prettier, but it works really well on the couple of songs where they do it, and I wish they did it more. So that's one thing. Let's ping pong this.
Well, the thing that I liked, or the first thing that I liked about this band, and I was having trouble sort of narrowing them down to what they're doing. Obviously there's a metal influence and obviously there's a punk influence, but it's like, well, what kind of bands have that kind of metal/punk influence? And then just today, I was listening to on, if you have a DirecTV or a satellite channel or satellite dish or something like that, you get music channels that you can put on, and there's a 90s alternative station on DirecTV. I believe it's called Reality Bites, and a song came on when I was not in the room, but I could hear the music, and I was like, I know this. What is this? And then I walked back in the room, and I was like, oh, it's Therapy. And it was a song Screamager from the album that we reviewed, Trouble Gum. And I was like, there you go. Therapy is, I guess, not the British version of this band, because I think they're a little bit different, but it had that same vibe where it has these definite punk roots with this metal influence, and the vocal in a lot of ways reminded me of it, and the attitude and the delivery, taking those two sort of, different schools of rock music, in some ways polar opposite, molding them together into that really unique sound that Therapy does, and then also the way that this band does too, because to be able to sing over like the punk beat of Furthest Place Away, but then also do that like Living Color-esque stomp on My Side. Really shows off a diverse, vocal ability, like you said, that I really enjoyed, which leads me into my next thing that I liked, which was for a band that, is playing in that punk metal space, they play around with a lot of different styles. I mentioned My Side having this like Living Color sort of feel to it. And then you have like a couple of songs like Furthest Place Away and Bad Blood, which have these more like old school kind of punk rhythms to them. Mm-hmm. You get that like thrash on IG, Indian Giver. There's a lot of different things that they're doing. Sometimes in the same song, going from punk to metal and back and forth, and they do it pretty seamlessly. And I really liked that aspect of it, where it didn't feel like jarring. It felt like this was a band that, in the scope of 2 or 3 minutes, these are pretty quick songs for the most part. They're able to jump from genre to genre fairly seamlessly.
Yeah, that's something that I really like about the record, because IG is a good example. When it starts off, you're very much in a thrash kind of fast punk kind of sound, but then you get to the chorus and it's not like that at all. It goes to halftime. Mm-hmm. It gets a lot more melodic. Then you get to the solo and it sounds like Metallica. So there's on the better songs on the record, there's a really cool mix of different styles and different parts within the same song. That's really hard to do. It's really hard to pull off. They pull it off for the most part really well. There are some songs, I would say, where I guess we can start sliding into the negative stuff. Starts to feel a little bit like a riff fest. like
Mm-hmm.
not a rib fest, but a riff fest. um,
We're all
but,
fans of rib fests.
Oh yeah, where you're just it's just one riff after another. There's a couple tunes on here where it feels a little bit like that, and it's less about songwriting. But the shifts to halftime and the more melodic type arrangements were really unexpected on this, and it's obviously the part that grabs my ear. Song like "Furthest Place Away," it's probably my favorite song on the record. At times it starts off, it's kind of sounds like a more metal version of Dinosaur Jr., but then it switches into this kind of a Replacements feel. Like it's punky, but it still has a lot of melody. Then it gets really singable with the harmony in the chorus, and good. The guitar solos are good. They have purpose in the songs. They're not just like noise or noodling. For the most part, they're forcing a melody or introducing a new melody for the chorus. So those bits and parts in songs where it shifts into a whole different mood, usually more of a major kind of feel, and then back to more of a minor, darker feel.
Mm-hmm.
It's what kept my interest in the record for sure.
In terms of when you transitioned into what you didn't like, I feel like some of the songs are a little underbaked. I understand this is like a debut record. Two of the songs, "Weak as Piss" track 3 and "Frayed Not" track 13 were singles that were released. I believe both were released before the record, and then they were included on the record. This was a band that was 2 years into being a band. Sometimes not all the ideas are fully fleshed out in terms of what you're trying to do as a band. So some of the stuff, it doesn't feel quite as original. The stuff that relies more on a traditional punk feel doesn't necessarily work as well for me. I like the song "All-Star Jam," but it's followed by, the song before it, "Me to Know." They try to play in like a halftime for a lot of that song, and it drags, and it's the longest song on it's the second longest song on the record. Doesn't necessarily work for me. I don't like this band playing in that like slow space for extended periods of time. Just sort of feels like any sort of generic alternative metal band from the 90s when they're doing that.
Yeah, I do like. I think those are the moments though that his voice saves it. So as long as he's singing during those parts, I felt like it was okay. It elevated the sound of his voice and the melodies he's singing. Saved it for me, but I know where you're coming from. Some of the funny about that song is that the intro riff sounds a lot like Firehouse or Slaughter. Like just the intro bit. I don't even think they go back to it. It's just the part that starts the song. You're like, oh my God, I feel like I'm listening to a Firehouse record. Then it switches to like more of a Sabbath kind of thing and into a whole other riff. But just that beginning part is just one of those times where you're like, wow, these guys are really, this is the early 90s, and they were doing some other stuff in the 80s, I think, when they were learning to play guitar.
Yeah, I think it's a bit more like of a major riff,
Yeah.
and then it goes to that like darker, minor Sabbathy thing that you're talking about. And that, speaking of major to minor, the one thing I think that they do a little too much of is going to the halftime chorus. They do it on like at least four songs, maybe even 5 songs if I need to go back and count. They do it on like really major melody, which was a song that like I had high hopes for when it started, and then kind of didn't go anywhere for me.
Yeah, that's a song where I agree. When it started and the first time I listened to it, I liked it, and then the more I invested in it, the less I liked it, because it started to reveal that like they're almost making fun of themselves, or lyrically, and it almost becomes a kind of a joke song.
Right.
The more you understand what they're doing, it's unfortunate because I think there's parts of that song that sound really cool. I just don't think they knew what to do with it. I think they had something there and they just kind of like screwed around with it and sort of made it into a half a joke. And threw it on the record. I think it would fall into your category of half baked.
Yeah.
Like the song before it, though, Helicopter. It reminded me of. I mean, these guys are really good musicians. It reminded me of like a song off a Steve Vai album or something, because it's mostly instrumental and it's just a bunch of parts, and the way that the parts kind of sound and the way it's based off riffs and stuff. It reminded me of like a song that would be on a Steve Vai album. Without a song like where there's no singer and you're trying to make the guitar melodies be the vocal part, and just the way that it has like a ton of different parts and a ton of different riffs in it. And I'm like, oh, I kind of get this. This is like punk version of a Steve Vai song.
It just to complete the Steve Vai sort of vibe, it would have needed a very instrumentally breakdown part.
Oh yeah. I'm mostly referencing like guitar instrumental albums.
Right.
It had that kind of vibe to it. That song.
And then the one other song that didn't work for me was the closing track, Cheers, which felt like that could have just been left off. It's the longest song by quite a bit, and it has no purpose. It's just this like, it almost sounds like it could have been a grunt. It could have been like on a grunt truck album as like a hidden track or something like that. Like it just doesn't seem to like fit this record for me. It's just weird. It's just
the best part of the song for me is there's like a middle section where it's just bass and vocals, and the bass part sounds a lot like Geezer Butler. Like sounds like something he'd play on bass. So that was probably that's probably the only time on the record where it's just like the vocal and one other instrument where they get that quiet, and it was kind of nice to hear that. But as a song, it's kind of meandering. I wouldn't say a mess, but it just meanders.
So here's the question. Scott Russell Helgram mentioned hearing bands like Seaweed and the Descendants. I didn't hear a lot of Seaweed. Did you?
I heard.
Am I interrupting your dinner, Jay?
No, I got a little ice here. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
I heard the Seaweed didn't jump to mind. I could see that, I guess, now that I've heard that reference. I was looking more like Bad Religion. So there'd be like it's a punk kind of aesthetic, but it's melodic and very like compressed, chunky guitars and very precise and, well executed punk. So whenever I hear something like that, I think of like Bad Religion, but I think Descendants and Seaweed they're in the same ballpark, I would think.
Yeah, that makes more sense to me. I hear the Bad Religion more so than Seaweed. I just think of Seaweed as being more in like not as punky as some of this record.
Yeah,
is.
they don't do as much like the stereotypical like that drum beat that you hear a lot on here, like the really fast punk style drum beat. You don't hear that Seaweed do that very often. a little bit more of a straight up rock sound from a rhythm standpoint. But speaking of rhythm, I think something that's cool on this album that's maybe not apparent to everyone is that while the guitars are very 80s kind of metal tone or thrash metal tone, and sometimes the riffs are in that area as well. I love that there's moments where they contrast that with rhythms that are more from a, I'd say, alternative rock or even like a post-hardcore kind of feel. So they'll be a little bit more like tom based, with accents on the ride and like doing more dynamics. And so they don't, I just like that combination. Like I could hear this, a lot of these songs would be way less interesting if the drummer approached it from a metal point of view. And they really aren't, which is very, I think, what makes it work. While the guitars are, at times straight up. I mean, there's parts in here. I had notes like All-Star Jam. There's a part in there where the bass sounds like Iron Maiden. There's another song that has like very much has a gallop to it, guitar and bass wise, and kind of a classic metal gallop to it. But the drums don't do that. They are coming from a completely different direction, which the combination of those two things is it's a good thing. Actually, in a lot of ways, almost at times better than even what therapy does, because I think therapy sometimes is, they're both maybe coming from more of a metal standpoint together, so you don't end up with as much contrast there. But what did you think about, should be My Side and may have been Afraid Not, but I'm sorry, Cheers. So My Side and parts of Cheers have kind of a rap metal feel to them, or at least in the way that the rhythm and the vocal delivery is treated. It starts to feel a little bit, maybe this is where the comment about it being
Chili Peppers,
and Faith No More-ish, it's coming from. I'm not a fan of that kind of stuff, but it was kind of interesting the way they did it. It made me think more of a band like Biohazard than maybe Faith No More, just because it's a little bit darker. But I don't know. How did you feel about those?
I really did not pick up on like a Chili Pepper vibe at all. More in the Faith No More end of it, and like in Biohazard's a good. Well, it's irrelevant. I don't know if it's a good comparison, but it's a relevant comparison. I heard it, and I mentioned like with My Side, I mentioned that it had sort of a living color feel to it.
Yeah.
Even the vocal approach, with the harmonies and it's very melodic, where some of the songs are not as melodic. That to me was a closer comparison. I always think of Faith No More as being more quirky, and
yeah,
I don't know if the comparison is simply because that the drum beat in My Side has a feel of like epic.
Yeah, and the vocal delivery in the verses gets a little rapish, like the way he delivers the lines. It's very much it's melodic, but it's very rhythm oriented. It doesn't go over the line where you're like, oh, he's rapping, but you just sort of like he's in the groove with the drums, and it gets in that ballpark, which I wasn't sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing for this band. And I think it's really only happens on this song and a little bit on the other song I mentioned, which makes it even more of a question of like, why are they going there?
I think as long as he stays away from actually rapping, he's okay.
Yeah.
If he were to drop some actual rhymes, this would have devolved into something. This would have been turned into the Funk Junkies, and we don't need that to happen. So,
Wow.
for anybody who remembers the Funk Junkies,
I don't. I'm glad I don't.
Their only hit was a cover of "I Love It Loud" by Kiss, but rapped
Oh God.
with like with a big fat beat
Oh, that sounds awful.
and like keyboard, or not keyboard, but like scratching, and done with like super overcompressed guitars. And
Was their album called Funk Among Us?
what was the name of their album? Hold on. Now I gotta look it up. Now I gotta see.
Is it Abracadooby?
Well, first of all, it was Funk Junkies, PHUNK JUNKEEZ. Funk
course.
Junkies. They were from Phoenix, Arizona, and their album that they broke through on was called Injected. Track 2, I Love It Loud. Appropriate enough, it was released on Trauma Records, and because that caused some trauma releasing that cover. I'm trying to see where I Love It Loud reached a peak of number 38 on the U.S. Billboard Hot 100, and it was in the Tommy Boy soundtrack. There you go.
You got a good memory, man.
Well, no, that's what.
No, I just that you even remember that band. and
Oh,
the song.
I'll never forget that song. I will never. You should hop onto Spotify and see if you can
No,
listen.
I don't want to hear that.
You want to hear it? Yeah, you do. Oh, yeah, you do. They were a band that was like a cross between. They were in the 311 camp. Let's just put it that way.
Awful and crappy.
Yeah,
That's what they were a cross between that.
they. Yeah, that was all that's horrible things that were happening, and I'm sure that they played with Insane
That was
Clown
a-
Posse, and
Oh, that was a dark period.
there was a whole bunch of bands. They put out albums up till 2007. So their albums they're self-titled, then Injected, Fear of a Whack Planet, Sex, Drugs, and Rap and Roll,
Oh no.
Rocket
No.
Rocket Science, and Hydrophonic. Besides I Love It Loud, their other big singles were Me in Your Girl, American Pimp, Hazy, Hazee, I Am a Junkie. So the band the Funk Junkies had a song called I Am a Junkie. I need to hear that. Oh, they have a filmography too. Bootlegs, bong rips, and bad videos.
Oh,
I need to know everything about the Funk Junkies. Jay, let's move along from the Funk Junkies
Please,
let's get
please.
into our reviews in totem. This particular record, our ratings. We've talked about things we didn't like. We've talked about things we liked. I don't know if it's clear where we're landing on this record, so I'm going to throw it to you first, Jay. Is this a worthy album? Is this a better EP, or is this a decent single?
I think this is a very interesting band, and I think it's the kind of album that makes me want to explore the catalog a little bit more, probably the later stuff, more so than the early stuff. I think this album suffers a little bit from it being their first record and them not quite knowing what it is they want to do yet. And the song, at the end of the day, the biggest knock for me is the songwriting is just not quite where it needs to be. The better stuff that they do is really short. Like a song like Sniffy kind of takes everything they do great and condenses it down to 1 minute and 37 seconds. And if the rest of their material is sort of in that direction, maybe not, album songs that are that short, but just that focused. Yeah, that focused, that would be good. So I'm going to come out with an EP. I think I've got 4 songs that I really like, and there's parts of a lot of the other songs I like, but not complete songs.
I'm pretty close to where you're at. I'm also in an EP. I think I'd go with like 5 to 6 songs. As I think I'd take the first 4, and then probably add Sniffy and All Star Jam. So that would get me to 6 songs. I think that's a solid 6 tracks from this record. It's not half the record. It's a 14-song record. There are a number of songs you could get cut, obviously. I think there's a lot here to digest, even though it's there's a short songs. But I think that whether you're into sort of punk or thrash metal or metal in general, I think there's a lot to digest on this record that's pretty interesting. And like you, I am interested in finally exploring some of their later stuff, and even checking out the 90s albums, since there's 2 from the 90s and 2 from the 2000s. So I think this, it's a good plate setter and a table setter for the rest of this band. So good selection by Gavin Reed. We want to thank him for suggesting this for us. I know he was a little nervous based on the age of this record and would it stand up, and I think that elements and parts of it do stand up, and they're stand up well enough for us to want to go listen to some other stuff by this band. So if you would like to suggest an album for us to review, you can head on over to our request a review page at digmeoutpodcast.com. And if you like what you heard, please consider leaving us some positive feedback over at iTunes. We want to thank everybody for listening on Radio I.O. and Stitcher and all of our other outlets. Please be sure to visit digmeoutpodcast.com for weekly news and previews of upcoming episodes. For Jay, I'm Tim, and we are out. Another one in the books. We'll be back next week with another episode. Dig Me Out.
Join the conversation about this episode at digmeoutpodcast.com, where you can find links to our Facebook page and Twitter feed, as well as links to our request a review and merchandise pages.